I'm delighted to welcome you to the second in our series of WSRP lectures for this year and our last for the term. We won't have another one until February 3rd, when we will hear from Susan Crawford Sullivan about living faith, everyday religion, and mothers in poverty. So have a good Christmas break. I know you'll do a few other things before that, but we look forward to seeing you again in February. I'm delighted to welcome Tania Oldenhage tonight and to introduce her talk. Tania is a New Testament scholar who comes to us from Switzerland, where she has been working at the Protestant Academy of Basel, where she co-founded and spearheaded the Network for Gender-Conscious Theology. And I'm sure that sounds better in another language, but it sounds pretty good in English, too. I don't think we have one here yet, but I hope that we will emulate you and also have a network for gender-conscious theology in the United States. Tania has published her first book already, which is entitled Parables for Our Time, Rereading New Testament Scholarship After the Holocaust. And she has continued with the study of post-Holocaust hermeneutics and has returned to the University of Basel, where and this is really bad, this is my second reception tonight, and I had a glass of wine, and I can't remember what is the next thing you do after the doctorate in the habitation. Thank you very much, which she is working on at the University of Basel. And that's part to what she will speak to us tonight is part of that project she is working on there.
Thank you so much, Anne, for this inspirational introduction. What I'm going to share with you tonight is a very fresh piece of writing, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to present this piece in such a wonderful setting and in front of such a very special audience. And I'm going to talk about a central part of a larger project that is, very broadly speaking, dedicated to the New Testament passion narratives. And it is a part, and I was trying to find the right word for this, and my colleagues from the WSRP helped me to find it. It's a part of my work that is kind of jarring, and that also led me to issues that I didn't expect when I came in August and started my research. All the more so, I'm very happy about this chance to present and discuss this part of my work. So the title of my project is Blessed Are the Barren. Blessed Are the Barren is a citation from the Passion story in the Gospel of Luke, and it belongs to a Lucan scene in which Jesus is on the way to the place of execution, and he is followed by a group of weeping women. The women are beating their breasts and they are wailing for him. Jesus turns to them and says, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are surely coming when they will say, Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed." And the saying of Jesus continues with a citation from the prophet Hosea. "Then they will begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, cover us." I have become interested in this text because it invites an interpretive process that encourages readers in the midst of Jesus' passion to make connections to other people's experiences, and in particular to women's experiences in times of catastrophe. From the point of view of the reader who is following Jesus' ordeal, from the night of betrayal to the arrest, to the various trials and mistreatments, to the crucifixion, the passage can be irritating because it interrupts the reading process. In contrast to Mark, Matthew, and John, who all in their own ways they focused on Jesus' suffering, Luke, in the middle of his passion story, is asking the reader, at least for a moment, to shift the attention away from Jesus' suffering and to consider the plight of other people. So what is going on in this passage? Scholars who have written on this text, trying to make sense of it, have been drawing from all different kinds of sources. They have been drawing from the Hebrew prophets, from the Greeks, from apocalyptic writers, from ascetics, from the rabbis, and in many cases these parallel texts feature women and infants, breasts and wombs, nursing, birthing, pregnant, and barren women. Luke's blessing of the barren compels readers to make links to stories of women who find themselves in catastrophic situations. Why did I sit upon the birth stool to bring forth a son to the earth? Because a woman in the apocalypse of Elijah who has given birth, by her city is destroyed. And the book of Lamentations captures the horror of the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians by speaking of infants dying on the breasts of their mothers. The Lucan Jesus himself draws from this kind of imagery when he foretells the second destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans several hundred years later. Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing infants in those days, he says a little earlier in the Gospel in chapter 21. So it is in this broad literary context that the blessing of the barren has to be placed. The blessing of the barren too speaks of the destruction of the city, taking recourse to the imagery of women's bodies. From a distance and in a very general sense, these ancient texts point out something that we all know. Pregnant and nursing women are especially vulnerable in times of crisis. Famine can stop the milk supply of women who breastfeed their children. Women who are forced to give birth without help are under great risk. The destruction of shelters, of medical assistance, of food supplies endangers the lives of everybody, but it endangers the lives of pregnant and nursing women in particular ways. So from a socio-historical point of view, it makes a lot of sense when these ancient texts about catastrophe are invoking the bodies of women. At the same time, these texts may still serve a variety of rhetorical purposes. What are they supposed to evoke in their audience? And in what mode and from what perspective should we read them? Historical critical exegesis, by and large, and up to the present, has treated the blessing of the barren as a text with a message about a sinful nation. And I'm trying now to summarize an impression I gained from studying mostly German and North American 20th century scholarship. And I need to talk about a trend in the scholarly discourse that I found quite excruciating. Scholars and commentators on the Lucan passage have been writing within a frame of reference in which the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70 is theologized as God's punishment for Israel's rejection and crucifixion of Jesus. And when placed within that framework, Jesus' blessing of the barren is said to confront the weeping women of Jerusalem not only with an announcement of terrible things to come, but also with an explanation of why these terrible things have to occur. They have to occur because of what a German scholar writing in the early 1990s calls the overwhelming stubbornness and blindness of Israel. Scholars have debated in what tone Jesus delivers this message to the weeping woman, whether he's speaking it as a threat or as a warning or as a call to repentance. And they also debate whether the women represent the guilty part of Israel or whether they have to be considered innocent victims of a kind of event that is still considered to be a punishment of the crime of the Jewish leadership. The overall notion that the upcoming catastrophe is an act of divine retribution for Israel's sins runs through the history of exegesis of this passage. The example I want to give you comes from my own context. In 1963, Walter Kaiser, a Swiss Reformed theologian, published an essay on the Lucan passage that was published in the well-known German New Testament journal Zeitschrift für die Neutestamentliche Wissenschaft. Kaiser's essay from 1963 is up to this time still one of the very, very few essay-length articles dedicated entirely to the blessing of the Barren. And in this essay, Kaiser reads the weeping women of Jerusalem as a metaphor of what he calls carnal Israel. And he calls the mothers proud of their biological offspring, and he suggests that they represent the sinful people who, by crucifying the Messiah, have called upon themselves their own condemnation and destruction. In contrast, the barren women are blessed because they represent the Gentile church that from now on is the recipient of God's steadfast promise. And those of you who are familiar with the sources behind this kind of study, he's using the first verse from Isaiah 54, where the prophet is addressing the barren women and asks them to rejoice because they will have children in the future. To me, Kaiser's essay demonstrates what happens when Christian supersessionism gets a hold of female biblical imagery. Kaiser calls the women of Jerusalem mothers proud of their offspring. And while for him these mothers serve to symbolize the whole nation, they also, of course, for him serve to personify and to feminize the destruction of Jerusalem. What gets announced in Luke's text, as Kaiser in himself emphasizes, is not just the end of of God's promise to carnal Israel, but also a real historical event, the destruction of maternal bodies and the end of reproduction. Today, this kind of language would raise immediate concern. However, I need to emphasize that the anti-Jewish discourse on the blessing of the barren has not been discussed in any detail up to this time, and it has been addressed only by very few scholars. Professor François Beauvant, in his 2009 commentary, does draw attention to the anti-Jewish hostility in the reception history of Luke 23. And in the 1980s, Charles Homer Giblin offered a reading of Luke's blessing of the barren that highlights the Lucan Jesus' solidarity with the Jewish people. But these voices are exceptions. Unlike other New Testament texts that, especially after Vatican II, have become the focus of large debates of how to deal with what many perceive to be the anti-Jewish trends of the New Testament, the blessing of the barren continues to be read through such patterns of interpretation, and this, I have to say, threw me off in my work, and I do wonder whether this lack of attention has something to do with the fact that we're dealing with a text about women, and it is a text not only about women, but about women who communicate not through their words, but through bodily actions, through the shedding of tears, the beating of breasts, the birthing of children, things that have a history of being ignored by mainstream biblical scholarship. Scholars in the United States have perpetuated the discourse of their German-speaking colleagues. In 1983, 20 years after Walter Kaiser published his essay, Catholic scholar Jerome Neyre, in another essay-length article, summarizes the thrust of Jesus' saying in the following way: "Those who weep are not blessed. They are not believers, and their weeping is not the result of their faith in Jesus. Those with children will weep because their children are perishing. No salvation here." What has struck me in these scholarly texts is a failure or an unwillingness to be unsettled by the horrors that the scholars uncover in Luke's text, because these are scholars who have studied the ancient sources closely enough to be aware of what they're dealing with. They know that they are dealing with the text about extreme violence. And some of them do use their imagination to elaborate on that. And there are a couple of scholars, for example, who refer to the ancient wartime practice of disemboweling pregnant women and killing their unborn children. Most scholars offer at least a little bit of consideration of what might await the weeping women of Jerusalem. Theologian Anne Elvey has helped me to find a language of what is going on. She argued that the Lucan text itself participates in a refusal to enter fully the space of the tragic. But Luke's text, it seems to me, does invite into this unbearable space, if only for a moment. And it's not that the scholars do not enter this tragic place. They do enter, but then they leave it and go on to reinforce the notion that the suffering was deserved. Now one could argue that the task of New Testament scholars is to articulate for their audience the theology making of Luke, the gospel writer. And if Luke, the gospel writer, interprets the destruction of Jerusalem as divine punishment, then one could continue, it is the task of the scholars to point that out. And it is true, if you look at this text, the blessing of the Barren is followed by a sentence from the prophet Hosea, and it's a sentence of doom that he throws at sinful Israel. So if Luke, in his larger text, is operating within a sin and retribution pattern of interpretation, one could argue again, there might be no way to read the blessing of the Barren other than as a judgment oracle against a guilty nation. But it seems to me there are several things to be said against such an assessment. Especially since the 1980s, there have been various attempts to read Lucan text against the grain of anti-Jewish rhetoric. And Luke's gospel offers enough resources to at least nuance the discourse on sinful nation, especially with its quite positive portrayal of the Jewish people. The Bible itself offers models of how a sin and retribution pattern of interpretation can break down. Alan Mintz, professor of Jewish literature, has shown how the poet in the Book of Lamentations at one point fails to hold on to the paradigm of crime and punishment. In his lament over the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, the poet talks at one point about the suffering of infants, and it is here that he fails to stay serenely removed and is no longer able to explain to his audience why these things have to occur. And as long as he describes the destruction of state or institutions, he is in control of his voice, but the voice breaks down, as Mintz points out, at the sight of child suffering. And I'm quoting just a little piece of the Book of Lamentations. "My eyes are spent with tears, my heart is in tumult, my being melts away," the poet writes before conveying the sight of children dying on their mother's breasts. Containing the suffering and killing of children and women within a pattern of crime and retribution cannot be possibly fully successful, and Christian exegetes are struggling with that too when, for example, they debate the question whether or not there was also a tone of pity and compassion in Jesus' words of condemnation. American Catholic scholar Raymond Brown picks up on this possibility, and he offers his own readers a way to cope with the horror of this text. On the one hand, Brown is unrelenting when it comes to the harshness of Jesus' message. The message is, he writes, that now no amount of lamenting for what is being done to Jesus can save Jerusalem or its people from the destruction to come. But then I find it very interesting that Brown does concede that the women who are following Jesus are not hostile to Jesus, and that means that the suffering that awaits them will not be deserved. And he continues to make room for the pathos involved in this recognition. And again, I'm quoting a short sentence out of his book. Brown writes, Luke leaves open the possibility that God may have been touched by the tears of those who lamented what was being done to Jesus. So God may be touched by the women's tears, Brown suggests, which begs the question of how he himself works through this charged text on innocent Jewish suffering. One of the things that surprised me in my own effort to work through this text is the fact that there has been very little feminist engagement with Luke's blessing of the barren, despite its obvious invocation of women's bodies. The lack of gender-conscious research on this text may very well have something to do with the troubling history of scholarship that I just tried to outline. Who wants to deal with a text so charged and painful, and whose reception history almost draws one into anti-Jewish rhetoric? Among the very few feminist engagements with the blessing of the barren that I found is the work of Turid Carson Syme, a Norwegian theologian, who has written on the patterns of gender in Luke Acts. Syme reads Luke's blessing of the barren in light of what she calls Luke's ascetic preferences. And she's writing about the fact that the Gospel of Luke seems to have a preference for women who are childless, unmarried, and autonomous, able to travel and to follow Jesus and to work for the Gospel. Luke's blessing of the barren, Syme continues to argue, implies a contrast between the women disciples from Galilee, who are relatively autonomous, mobile, and able to follow Jesus, and the women of Jerusalem, who are bound by their motherhood. Blessed are the barren, according to this interpretation, really means blessed are the childless and ascetic women who follow Jesus. In another gender-conscious study of Luke's blessing of the barren, New Testament scholar Brand James Pittry comes to a similar conclusion when he is trying to read the blessing of the barren as part of what he considers to be a message of the historical Jesus. A call to celibacy in light of the upcoming crisis. The women of Jerusalem, he writes, are still under the impression that pregnancy and childbirth are desirable, but Jesus tells them how mistaken they are. Not motherhood, but childlessness is the desirable eschatological state, and Jesus enjoins women to enter into it. This is how Professor Peter is trying to make sense of the blessing of the barren. I disagree with these readings. I do not think that the blessing of the barren goes against biological motherhood. And again, I am wary of the undertones of such an interpretation, because of course the mothers are Jewish mothers, and the women from Galilee, they are Jewish as well, but they are anticipating the church. And I also do not think that Luke's blessing of the barren is a call to childlessness. And reading it as such, in my opinion, misses important clues in the passage. And now I'm starting to develop my own reading of this text. The performance of the Lucan Jesus in this text is neither pedagogical nor is it a blessing. Jesus does not give any advice, and he doesn't bless anybody. Instead, he invokes a collective anonymous voice, the days are surely coming when they will say, "Blessed are the barren." Unlike the well-known blessings from the Sermon on the Mount, this is a blessing that is put into the mouth not of Jesus, but of some other people. This very same people who will face a crisis so severe that they will ask the mountains to fall on them. When the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, they didn't make a distinction between barren and fertile women. Human lives got destroyed regardless whether people had children or not. The wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed perished like anybody else. Luke's blessing of the barren, I think, is not the kind of text that wants to make a point about how one should lead one's life. Instead, I think we need to read it as an anticipated cry of horror that works through its affect. I want to suggest that we read the Lucan passage first and foremost as a gendered way of drawing attention to an extremity of an upcoming catastrophe, and as such it resists in some ways interpretive efforts and meaning-making strategies. So in the middle of Luke's passion story, I see a rupture of a script and a breaking in of a catastrophic discourse whose aim is not to give meaning to suffering, but to draw attention to its extremity. Like the figure of the mothers whose babies die on their breasts in the book of Lamentations, the blessing of the barren is trying to give words to unbearable and indescribable events. I think we can learn to reread the Lucan passage by placing it next to literature of catastrophe from within our own world. I want to suggest an intertextual link that is able, I think, to open up the anti-Jewish grasp on this passage and helps us to respond more adequately to its female figuration of catastrophe. The intertextual link that I would like to suggest is between the blessing of the barren and the text that was written in the 1940s and published in the 1960s, and that today has become a very well-known piece of Holocaust literature. Its author is Charlotte Delvaux, a French poet and non-Jewish survivor of the German death camps, who was deported by the Nazis for her work in the French resistance. The text is entitled Arrivals, Departures, and describes the arrival of Jewish men, women, and children from all over Europe at Auschwitz-Birkenau. By using the language of ordinary train travel, Arrivals, Departures tries to describe something that, especially in the immediate post-war period, was beyond imagination. The people who arrive at the station have no idea what awaits them at this place. They expect the worst, but not the unthinkable, the poet writes. Delvaux's text carefully describes the diversity of the people who arrive at Auschwitz from different countries, different cultures, different class backgrounds. But she keeps returning to one particular image, and that is the figure of mothers worrying about their small children. And I'm going to quote a little piece from this text. Mothers keep a tight hold on their children, trembling at the thought they might be taken away, because the children are hungry and thirsty and disheveled by lack of sleep after crossing so many countries. At last, they have reached their destination. They will be able to take care of them now. A reader of Delvaux's text knows already that these mothers will not be able to take care of their children. Delvaux's lines historically need to be understood against the background of the Nazi war against Jewish life that targeted pregnant women and women of small children in particular ways. In April 1942, the German occupation authorities in Eastern Europe decided that all pregnant women in the ghettos should be killed, and when transports from the ghettos arrived at the death camps, and this is something that numerous survivors' testimonies have described, visibly pregnant women and women with small children were immediately selected to be murdered. So in some ways, Delbo's decision to foreground the fate of mothers and small children is a reflection of this particular aspect of Germany's genocidal war. But Delbo is doing more than informing her readers about the fate of mothers and children in Auschwitz. On the level of representation, the figure of the mother also helps her to begin to engage her readers on an emotional level and to draw them to unbearable and indescribable events. In parenthesis, I want to say that there is a growing body of literature by feminist scholars of Holocaust literature that is trying to explore critically the use of the maternal. And in some other context, I would need to talk also about the consequences of focusing on the maternal in literature of catastrophe. In this context and in relation to the current science of this lecture, it is important for me to notice and to emphasize that Delbo uses her maternal figures in more than one way. In the second part of her text, the poet changes her tone and she changes her genre. It is no longer the voice of a narrator in control of her writing giving account of other people's suffering. Instead, the poet addresses her readers directly from the perspective of a victim. Oh, you who know, did you know that you can see your mother dead and not shed a tear? Did you know that suffering is limitless, that horror cannot be circumscribed? Did you know this, you who know my mother? She was hands, a face. They made our mothers strip in front of us. Here, mothers are no longer mothers to their children. In this part of her text, the maternal images, which earlier were able to evoke feelings of perhaps universal currency, the anxiety of mothers who fear for the lives of their children, have given way to something else. Images of unmourned, dead, and naked mothers, women who have been robbed of their ability to act as mothers. Such images are more difficult to read. They refuse to offer ways of identification, and I think they resist also our attempt to make meaning out of them. Delbo's text at this point no longer implies readers who are sympathetic to the suffering she describes. Instead, Delbo struggles with her inability to put into words something that, as she says, cannot be circumscribed. And it is at this point that she changes her maternal figure. The mother who no longer is a mother forces readers not so much to share in the anxiety of someone who loses her child, but to confront the complete destruction of the bonds between mothers and children, and to understand that there may be no way to redeem it. To use a text about Jewish suffering during the Shoah in order to shed light on a text from the Christian canon is problematic and risky in many ways. I am taking the risk for a number of reasons. I find it difficult to read the Lucan passage without making connections to Holocaust literature from the cultural locations that I inhabit as a German national. The cultural reservoir from which I unwittingly draw is filled with texts, memoirs, fictions, testimonies of the Holocaust in which images of mothers and children prevail. Cynthia Ozick's Shawl, Nelly Sachs' Night of the Weeping Children, and Yitzhak Katzenelson's Song for the Murdered Jewish People are, together with Charlotte Delbo's writing, only some of the most well-known examples of Holocaust literature in which mothers and children are used to transmit the devastating effects of Nazi violence. The cultural imagination that I share is informed so much by this literature that the question of how to read first-century texts on Jewish suffering in light of this literature becomes, for me at least, increasingly pressing. However problematic the intertextual link between the Christian canon and Holocaust literature is, I think it is important to make it. not unlike Delbo's text. Luke's Blessing of the Barren can be read as a kind of literary piece that is trying to give voice to unspeakable catastrophic events. While Luke's Blessing of the Barren, unlike Delbo's text, is giving only a glimpse at catastrophe, it too, this text too, bears the signs of a struggle with the limits of language. Neither Delbo nor Luke give words to the catastrophe. Delbo conjures up for readers what she calls a nameless station. She doesn't mention the names of Auschwitz, and she doesn't give words to the death machinery. The Lucan Jesus also does not specify the catastrophe. The siege by the Romans, famine, killings, destructions, none of these things are put into words. At least in this particular text, the destruction of Jerusalem figures as an unnamed looming catastrophe that seems all the more threatening as it is unspoken. Like Delbo, Luke uses female images, weeping women, breasts, children, in order to put the unspeakable into language. But, and this is kind of the central part of my own reading of this text, but at the same time, and again, not unlike Delbo, Luke goes on to introduce a very different kind of maternal image. Wombs that never bore and breasts that never nursed. In its own way, I think, Luke's text enacts for its readers a transformation of maternal images. Earlier in the Gospel, the Lucan Jesus has already offered a maternal figuration of the destruction of Jerusalem. He said, "Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing infants in those days." While the plight of pregnant and nursing women in times of war is emotionally charged and painful in a way that may speak to readers across cultures and centuries, the figure of barren women works on a different level. Images of barrenness, like Delbo's image of the stripped and finally dead mother, replace in Luke's Gospel the affect of child-mother relations, and they are more difficult to integrate. By invoking people who bless the barren in an act of desperate irony, as though the barren would not be destroyed like anybody else, the Lucan Jesus points to a catastrophe so severe that traditional tropes fail to express it. The reading I'm suggesting here, I think, has no precedent in the scholarly discourse on Luke, and I am not claiming that Luke, the Gospel writer, intended his audience to read that way. But what I want to say is that this Lucan text has all the markers that ask us to read it not as an explanation for, but as an expression of extreme suffering. And I also want to say that reading it like this can serve as an urgent ethical intervention into the Christian reception history of this text. As a way to conclude, I would like to recall the moment in Delbo's text where the narrative voice breaks down and the poet suddenly is no longer confident in her ability to make her audience understand what she's saying. After recounting the anxiety of mothers waiting in vain to be able to take care of their children, Delbo interrupts her text and addresses her audience directly with reference to the suffering of Jesus. You who have wept, so this is a piece of Delbo's text, you who have wept for 2,000 years, for one who agonized for 3 days and 3 nights, what tears will you have left for those who agonized far more than 300 nights and far more than 300 days? I read these words as a way for the poet to express her suspicion that her audience may not be able or be willing to mourn for the fate of Jewish men, women, and children. She suspects that her readers are so focused on Jesus' suffering on the cross as to be open to what she has to say. And for Delbo, clearly, the Christian story of Jesus' agony stands in no comparison to the events of the Holocaust. If Jesus' passion was limited, theirs was incommensurable. These lines are provocative, and I do not think that we should take them as an invitation to engage in counting hours, days, or years of suffering, but as another way for the author, writing in the 1940s, to draw attention to the extremity of the events that she lived through, and also as an expression of her urgent need for an audience. Delbo is afraid that an audience that is focused on Jesus' suffering might be unable to hear her, and this fear does speak to the concerns that are raised in this lecture. Christian scholarship, by and large, has taken a particular interpretation of Jesus' death as a key for making sense of first-century Jewish catastrophe. Jerusalem was destroyed because its people crucified Christ. I have tried to argue that the blessing of the Barren can disrupt this interpretive discourse. It is a text that can be read as a struggle to express extreme suffering, and it is a text that powerfully resonates with literature that came out of the Shoah. Acknowledging these resonances can open up, or at least shift, a Christian grasp on Jewish catastrophe. And I thank you very much that you bear with me, and I am eager to hear your responses. Thank you very much.
We do have time for questions. If your breath isn't completely taken away at the moment, you can all take a deep breath and then perhaps start our discussion.
I was wondering if this says anything to what's happening in Jerusalem today, like with the expulsion of the Christian and Muslim population, and I imagine the women are women always take the brunt of it because they bear children, and I guess most Palestinian women do have a lot of children. But I was just wondering if you updated it today to what's happening in Jerusalem. Do you see any?
Yeah, that's kind of the most difficult question at the very beginning, but I thank you for it. And I'm aware that this kind of text, when you start to read it for the way in which gender operates and can evoke feelings, that it is able to resonate with events that are much more contemporary than the events of the Holocaust. In order to do this kind of intervention in the New Testament scholarly discourse, I had to really keep those resonances in brackets, and I can't respond to your question, but I know it's in the air.
I agree with you in terms of trying to get rid of the anti-Jewish interpretations. But how would the text read differently if one would not have just the gender analysis, but a feminist analysis in terms of imperialism? If one read, or in other words, if one would read the text primarily as Lucan reference after the effect of the destruction of Jerusalem, and not as a text juxtaposing the suffering of the women and the death of Jesus, but rather the suffering and the destruction of Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think another thing that I needed to bracket, and another thing that I did not offer, was a clear sense of, okay, where I didn't historicize this text, and I don't yet have an answer of, what is the what is the socio-political setting of this text as it emerged. I was trying to really think about, I don't know if you can call it reader response. I was kind of thinking about how this text is read by a contemporary audience, but I very much appreciate the suggestion to kind of venture into an attempt to locate this text and asking about questions that are going beyond gender. And I think if I want to do that, I would have to be more firm in my own sense of where is this text located. But thank you.
I'm interested in what you said about this being a disruption in the narrative as opposed to other passion narratives.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that function of rupture, and also if you saw that in other places in Luke or in other places of your readings of the New Testament, and what that rupture serves to stop the narrative of one person suffering to a larger subcommunal suffering.
It's certainly the one passage where I saw this most clearly. And, I've been so focused on this passage that I can't show you there's another. I did think, this earlier reference to pregnant and nursing mothers in Luke 21, the interesting thing about that verse is that it's, of course, part of other Gospels as well. So what does that mean? So there is a female figuration also in Matthew and in Mark. It's scripted differently. And it would be certainly interesting or important also to kind of see what the text is doing in these other two contexts.
Thank you for a very moving talk. I love the way you are reading Luke in light of Charlotte Delvaux. And my comment as a whole introduces a whole other intertextuality, I guess, which is when you first put the passage up, I started thinking about an essay by Lina Das, who's an anthropologist who's written a lot about partition, the aftermath of partition violence in the Indian subcontinent. And one of the concepts she develops is that the work of mourning is gendered work, is women's work. And this is a different moment of catastrophe, and that she's writing about. And so that was the first thing that came out at me, was that it's a blessed state to be, in some sense, absolved of the kinship bonds that destine you to this horrible, terrible labor of mourning. And so I love the way that came in through the Delvaux text. And I think that one of the ways that I look forward to seeing your argument unfold, because I know you're just in the beginning of the project, is this question of what is a mother? What does it mean to be a mother? What does it mean? What is this? A barren person in this context. It's partly the question of context, but what kind of a figure is this in relation to this question of kin?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you have any speculative response you want to offer at this point. I know it's a work in progress.
I think the only thing that I can say, and I'm very glad that we will have plenty of opportunity to talk about these things. And this is not really responding to your concerns, but what's really important for me to do while doing this work is reading texts other than from Charlotte Delvaux, where actually kinship is being used as a trope not by mothers but by fathers. So it's a certain type of kinship, nevertheless, but there is Holocaust literature written from the perspective of fathers who lose their children, and so in light of this, the idea of mourning being a labor that is gendered, I would really, it really would have to think more about that. Jesus weeps, there's a mourning moment in Jesus, also with Jesus also in the Gospel of Luke, where he weeps over Jerusalem.
Could you say just a little bit more about the pronoun they in the passage? You said that it represents the community. They will say, "Blessed are the barren." But I'm just wondering what you feel about whether or not Jesus agrees with this they or counts himself among the they, or whether it's a they that's to the other.
Okay, the Greek, for those who do the Greek, it's actually not as helpful as is the English translation. So there is no they in the Greek. It's evosi first and then ashontai legein in a second instance. So in the Greek there is no way for me to say, oh, here's the subject of the collective voice, which makes it a little bit complicated. But still, what I find interesting about your question is how is Jesus related to this third person plural? And this is also, again, something that I bracketed. How does all of this reflect on our understanding of Jesus' suffering? And in what kind of tradition do we place Jesus' suffering after I have done this kind of reading?
Tania, again, a wonderful, powerful presentation. Another angle that comes to my mind that you may or may not be interested in following up is this is one of the stations of the cross. And so around the churches, you always see this as one of the dramatic scenes. The three falls of Jesus meeting his mother, Simeon picking up the cross to carry it. And that is kind of both an ancient tradition and also part of any kind of, at least in the Roman Catholic tradition, liturgical conscience. These women are always there in the church, and there's always this kind of stylized encounter in every Catholic church. Do you think you can do anything with that in terms of how this scene is woven into Lent and woven into Catholic piety that might tease out some of the angles you're thinking of, or do you want to stay away from that kind of practice?
Thank you so much for this question that gives me a chance to show you something. Okay, I'm not an art historian, so I was kind of cautious and also not very good in giving you these images. It's true. It's also it's complicated because it's not that the blessing of the barren is a scriptural basis for one of the stations of the cross. The scene of Jesus meeting the women of Jerusalem is, and that's why we have all this artwork on the text. And what's to me really interesting and also kind of a hopeful thing in studying these images is that the binary between the mothers of Jerusalem and the disciples from Galilee gets disrupted because of what you see here. These women who are depicted, some of them are the disciples, right? Some of them are the women who follow Jesus. So there is something being disrupted what we have in at least in the scholarship. And I am interested in the way in which liturgy is also able to disrupt something that needs to be done and that I have tried to do by reading The Blessing of the Barren next to Charlotte Delbo's image. And that would be something that I would like to pursue, definitely. I think you would have to look about...
just even in terms of the arrivals and departures theme, the steps, the stops on the journey, and also the possible playoff between Mary, Jesus meeting his mother, and then talking to them about their children, and there might be all kinds of other angles that might enhance or deepen your case, by looking at that.
So if I have time for one other thing that I want to show you, in relation to your contribution. So this is something that I did not include in this talk, but that has also been important for me in doing this work. This is an image from 1993, and you see here women in Germany doing the Stations of the Cross, and they are on their way to the memorial place of the former women's concentration camp in Ravensbrück. So these are Catholic Polish survivors and German Catholics, and they have engaged in this ritual as a way to remember various experiences. But at the station that was dedicated to the weeping women of Jerusalem, they did confront a testimony about Jewish mothers. And there's so that's kind of the most, it's also not unproblematic, but it's kind of a powerful way to see how a ritual like that can also, break open some of these traditional interpretations.
Thank you so much.